Beneath the Waters, The Haunting of John and Clara. John and Clara, both comfortably into their early 50s, had always shared an affinity for the mysteries of the night. Years had rolled by, but their enthusiasm for night fishing had remained an undying constant. Their adult children found it strange, even eerie, but for John and Clara, these nocturnal outings were sacred rituals, a cherished pocket of solitude where the universe seemed to hold its breath. On the evening of September 5, 2023, John and Clara found themselves back at their cherished sanctuary, a secluded spot on the lake that had been their favorite fishing destination for years. At this special bend in the water, miles away from the nearest neighbor, the world felt both expansive and intimate, framed by a horizon of darkening trees and a sky generously sprinkled with stars. However, the atmosphere was different that evening, although neither could put their finger on it. The air was thick, almost suffocating, laden with a strange scent of decaying wood and freshwater algae. The lake seemed unusually still, as though it were holding its breath, and the normal cacophony of nighttime critters was eerily subdued. Clara, ever sensitive to energies, felt her skin prickle with an undefined sense of unease. John, too, couldn't shake off a crawling feeling at the base of his spine, but attributed it to the aging process. They exchanged an uncertain look but shrugged it off, attributing their misgivings to the trickery of the night air. As John baited his hook, a sudden gust of wind whipped across the boat, causing their old lantern to flicker erratically. For a split second, the lantern cast grotesque shapes on the water's surface, like ghostly figures trying to break free. Both were taken aback, but chalked it up to the capriciousness of nature. "Feel like we're being watched," Clara whispered, half joking as she cast her line into the obsidian water. "Just the spirits of the lake saying hello," John responded lightly, although his eyes surveyed the shoreline with a newfound wariness. Minutes later, Clara felt a tug on her fishing line. "I think I've got a big one," she said, her voice tinged with a forced enthusiasm. John chuckled. "All right, reel in that monster." As Clara began to reel in, something extraordinary happened. An inexplicable force seized her fishing line, pulling with an intensity that belied the placid surface of the lake. Before John could even shout a warning, Clara was violently yanked sideways. The boat shuddered and keeled as if struck by some invisible leviathan. In an agonizing split second that seemed to stretch for an eternity, Clara's eyes met John's. Wide, startled, filling with a haunting realization. Then, with a splash that sounded both sudden and muffled, as if the lake had swallowed the sound itself, Clara was gone. "Clara!" The cry tore itself from John's lungs as he lunged to the side of the boat, almost tipping it over in his frantic haste. His eyes scanned the dark water, but Clara was nowhere to be seen. The water had closed over her like a tomb. His hands plunged into the icy darkness below, groping blindly for the love of his life. His fingertips brushed against something, a slick fabric, her jacket. Summoning strength he didn't know he still possessed, John hauled Clara back into the boat, gasping and grunting with the effort. When he finally looked at Clara's face, what he saw defied explanation. Her eyes were wide open but vacant, as if she'd witnessed an unspeakable terror. Her lips were an unnatural hue, a shade of blue so dark it was almost black. But most unnerving was the speed of her passing. She had been submerged for perhaps a minute, surely not long enough to snuff out a life so vibrant, so full of spirit. Despite his trembling hands and tear-blurred vision, John administered CPR. Pressing his palms against her chest in rhythmic pushes that seemed to mock the beating heart they failed to revive. His breath, warm and living, filled her lungs, but could not stir her soul back into her body. Clara was gone. The love of his life, his partner for decades, lay lifeless next to him. Her vacant eyes seemed to gaze at something beyond the veil of life and death, something he could not see or understand. John's cries echoed across the lake, their forlorn notes swallowed by the dark water and the oppressive night air. The calls of the nocturnal birds, haunting and dissonant, seemed to close in around him, creating an eerie chorus that would serve as the only witnesses to his heart-wrenching loss. The days that followed were a haze of numbing procedures, police reports, autopsy findings, and funeral arrangements. According to the authorities, Clara had drowned, a tragic accident, yet the haunting look on her face, the unnatural color of her lips, and the speed with which she had passed, none of these could be explained. And so, John found himself alone in a house filled with memories, each room a shrine to a love story that was no longer being written. As night fell on the first evening he spent alone in their home, the isolation began to settle in like a thick fog. Sitting in his living room, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace, he sensed an overwhelming emptiness, punctuated only by the occasional mournful call of an owl from the woods surrounding his property. It was then that the first strange occurrence happened, a sudden, unexplainable noise from the kitchen. The sound of a utensil dropping, a clatter that shouldn't happen in an empty house. His heart pounding, John reluctantly stood up and ventured towards the kitchen. A single spoon lay on the tiled floor, right in the middle, as if deliberately placed. He bent down to pick it up, and as he did, he felt a cold draft sweep through the room, even though all the windows were securely shut. Picking up the spoon, he felt an irrational surge of anger, almost as if he had been violated. That night, he tossed and turned in his bed, restless as if the walls of the house had eyes that were intently watching him. The second event happened the next night. Restless and insomniac, he'd been flipping through an old photo album, looking at pictures of happier times. He suddenly felt a chill, the air growing dense around him. As he looked up, his gaze was drawn to a corner of the room where Clara's favorite chair stood. For a moment, a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, he thought he saw her. A silhouette, ethereal yet palpably real, momentarily imprinted on the fabric of the chair. An aching sadness filled him. His eyes welled up as he stared at the now empty chair. Sleep eluded him again that night, the vividness of what he saw making him question his sanity. His dreams, too, took a dark turn. Night after night, he found himself standing at the edge of the lake, the water as still as glass. Yet in his dreams, the lake seemed to beckon him. He'd see Clara's form rising from its depths, her arms outstretched, her face contorted in a wordless plea, before sinking back into the dark water. Each morning after, he woke up drenched in sweat, the sorrow in his heart replaced by a terrifying disquiet. He felt as if Clara was trying to communicate something to him, something urgent, but he was unable to grasp the message. Soon, the dreams took a toll, blurring the line between his waking and sleeping worlds. His thoughts were consumed by the lake, the place where his life had shattered, yet the only place he felt close to Clara. As if in a trance, he found himself compelled to revisit that dreaded location. Maybe it was madness, or perhaps it was an irrational hope that he might find answers. Packing a flashlight and a bottle of whiskey for courage, John drove to the lake late one night, his heart in his throat, but a strange resolve solidifying within him. The lake looked different at night, more ominous, but also more mystical. It was as if it existed in a different dimension after the sun went down. With every step he took toward the water's edge, the air grew colder, denser, almost warning him to turn back. But he couldn't. It was as if an invisible string was pulling him closer and closer to the dark, reflective surface. He sat there for hours, his eyes scanning the water, his ears straining to hear something, anything, that might bring sense to his fractured world. As the clock on his phone neared midnight, a new sound began to fill the air, a soft, almost melodic humming coming from the depths of the lake. A sense of dread gripped him, but it was too late to turn back. That night, as he finally left the haunting waterside to return home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving a piece of himself behind, captivated by the siren call of the lake. An unspeakable dread filled his chest, the enormity of his grief mingling with the inexplicable happenings, forcing him to acknowledge that he might never find peace again. With each passing night, John felt the boundaries between reality and the surreal continuing to blur. The house itself seemed to participate in this unsettling transformation. Creaking floorboards, shadows dancing on the walls, and whispers in the wind that seemed to carry Clara's name. John's emotional state fluctuated from anger to despair, and then to a kind of morbid curiosity. What was this uncanny force that seemed to hover over him, pulling him deeper into an abyss? His late-night drives to the lake became a ritualistic pilgrimage. Each time he felt as though he was crossing an unseen boundary, moving from the realm of the living into a liminal space where the natural laws didn't apply. Yet he couldn't resist the lure. Something was calling him, or perhaps someone. On the night of September 12th, exactly a week after Clara's death, he found himself at the lake again. He parked the car a little farther away this time, as if keeping a respectful distance from a holy or perhaps cursed ground. As he sat there in the stillness, the moon's reflection over the lake seemed unusually vivid, giving the water an otherworldly glow. A loon called in the distance, its haunting cry echoing over the water, amplifying the sense of isolation. Then it happened. A splash in the water, not too far from the shore. It sounded larger than a fish, more like something or someone had just broken the surface. Heart pounding in his chest, John shone his flashlight toward the sound. The beam pierced through the darkness but revealed nothing, just ripples on the water fading into the blackness. Fear wrestled with curiosity. He felt a shiver down his spine, yet he couldn't help but wonder, could it be Clara? As he sat there contemplating this, he felt an odd mixture of excitement and dread, like a moth irresistibly drawn to a flame, yet aware of its destructive potential. He decided to stay longer, past midnight. As if on cue, the soft, melodic humming from the previous visit began to reverberate again. This time, however, it was accompanied by something else, a whisper almost drowned out by the humming, but distinct enough for him to notice. It sounded like a voice, Clara's voice, uttering something incomprehensible. The mixture of the haunting melody and the familiar timbre of his wife's voice had a hypnotic effect. Deeply shaken, yet inexplicably comforted, John felt tears stream down his cheeks. He had never felt so close yet so far from Clara. Finally, the cold and fatigue began to set in. Reluctantly, he left the lake, his head filled with more questions than answers. As he drove back, the surreal experiences of the night swirled through his mind, entangling with his emotions, making him question the solidity of his world and his place in it. He returned home, still wrapped in the enigma that the lake presented. Each strange event seemed to thread into the next, creating a tapestry of haunting beauty and terrifying mystery. As he lay in bed, his thoughts drifted to the spoon, the silhouette, the dreams, and finally to the haunting whispers and melodies of the lake. It was all too fantastic to comprehend, too intimate to ignore. A cocktail of fear and yearning made it impossible for him to distinguish nightmare from reality, pulling him further away from the world he once knew, yet paradoxically closer to the woman he couldn't bear to let go. John had lost track of the days, immersed as he was in the enigma that his life had become. His eyes were ringed with dark circles, his skin had gone pale, and his normally neat appearance was now disheveled. But appearances mattered little to him now. He was focused solely on the nightly visits to the lake, drawn there as if by magnetic force. Each visit seemed to push the boundary of the inexplicable a bit further, yet the answers he sought remained elusive. On this night, he felt a strange sense of purpose, as if he were on the cusp of a revelation. Arriving at the lake, he noticed a mist rolling in, shrouding the moon and stars in a ghostly haze. The water looked darker, more foreboding, and the trees at the edge of the lake seemed to close in like sentinels, guarding a forbidden realm. His eyes were pulled to a particular spot, where the trees parted slightly as if forming a gateway. As he watched, frozen in place, he saw her, or thought he did, emerging from the shadows between the trees. It was a figure draped in white, with long flowing hair. It was Clara, but not Clara, an apparition that resembled her, yet seemed distorted, almost wraith-like. The figure moved towards him slowly, as if gliding over the ground, and a profound dread filled him. Paralyzed, he felt his sanity teetering on the edge. But before he could completely unravel, the figure stopped and receded, disappearing back into the mist-shrouded trees. A torrent of emotions engulfed him. Relief, disappointment, but most of all, a paralyzing fear that seemed to originate from some primal part of his soul. As he left the lake that night, his body felt heavy, as if he were dragging an invisible weight. He realized he was no longer just a grieving widower. He had become part of something far more complex and terrifying. A newfound clarity began to settle in, and with it, an icy realization. He was being hunted, not guided. It was as if the lake itself, or some malevolent force residing within it, was toying with him, drawing him into its snare just as it had ensnared Clara. Returning home, he was consumed by a chilling thought. Had Clara experienced the same paralyzing dread during her final moments? Had she too seen the haunting apparition that now stalked him? The walls of his home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. But the lake was no refuge either. It was a malevolent entity, its tranquil surface belying the horror that lurked within. His emotions swirled in a vortex of terror and confusion, his soul torn between the ache to understand and the fear of what that understanding might bring. Sleep was restless and punctuated by nightmares that revisited every harrowing experience he had endured since Clara's inexplicable death. In these dreams he could hear her screams, see her terror, and feel her despair. Emotions so vivid that they seared through him like a hot iron, and when he woke up, the boundary between dream and reality was almost non-existent. Nights turned into days and days into nights, but for John, the border between them had all but vanished. Consumed by the harrowing events he had experienced, he could no longer find comfort in the light of day or the darkness of night. A perpetual twilight seemed to cloud his vision, both literally and metaphorically. On the eve of September 19th, exactly 2 weeks since Clara's untimely passing, he felt an undeniable urge to return to the lake one last time. The pull was overwhelming, a compulsion so intense that it felt like an addiction. As he drove, the air grew thick with tension, almost as if the night itself were holding its breath in anticipation. Arriving at the lake, he noticed that the mist was thicker than ever, creating an ethereal stage set for the climax of this macabre drama. He hesitated at the water's edge, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But something compelled him to wade into the water, step by agonizing step, until he was waist-deep. Suddenly the lake roared to life. Visions flashed before him, the spoon, the silhouette, the apparition, all blending into a nightmarish kaleidoscope. And then he saw her. Clara emerged from the water, her eyes empty, her face twisted in an expression of horror and despair. But she was not alone. Behind her loomed another figure, darker, more menacing, a shadowy form that seemed to feed off the terror emanating from her visage. Realization flooded over John with chilling clarity. Clara had not merely drowned, she had been consumed by this malevolent entity, an ancient force bound to the lake, a hunter stalking its prey through the veil of sorrow and despair. And now it was his turn. As the dark figure moved toward him, John's instincts finally kicked in. Mustering every ounce of willpower, he turned and waded frantically toward the shore. His feet felt like they were encased in cement, but he pushed through the resistance with desperate strength. Just as he reached the shore, he felt a malevolent force lunge at him from the depths, missing him by mere inches. Gasping for air, trembling uncontrollably, he staggered back to his car and drove home at breakneck speed, never once looking back. But as he entered his house, he knew that while he may have escaped the lake, the haunting would never truly leave him. For the rest of his days, he would be bound to that nightmarish entity by the chain of his grief, a predator and its prey locked in an eternal dance. As he lay in bed that night, his mind racing, he realized the horrifying truth. Clara had never been guiding him. Rather, the lake, this malevolent ancient entity, had used her memory as bait. And just like him, Clara had been drawn to the lake by a blend of sorrow and some darker, indefinable emotion, until she was ultimately consumed. In his heart-wrenching journey for answers, he had come perilously close to sharing her terrible fate. John never returned to the lake, but he knew he would forever be haunted by its malevolent presence, a dark shadow cast over his soul. The entity remained, lurking in the depths, awaiting its next victim, forever bound to the sorrow that drew lost souls to its waters. And so, the lake remained. Serene, beautiful, and eternally deadly.